In the shadow of Europe's trenches, another war unfolded. One the textbooks quietly erased. Across endless deserts and jagged mountains, the world's empires collided, carving territories with pens and promises, while men bled unseen. The sun scorched bodies into the sand, and the nights whispered with the cries of revolutionaries who believed in freedom, yet were shackled by the deceit of diplomats far from the battlefield. Every map redrawn here would ripple through history, shaping borders, faiths, and futures in ways no European general ever imagined. This was a war fought in silence, yet its echoes still define the modern world. A war whose name has been forgotten, but whose consequences remain unavoidable. In shadowed tents far from the desert's edge, empires whispered promises they never intended to keep. Arab leaders were shown visions of independence, banners raised for freedom from Ottoman rule. Yet behind closed doors, European diplomats were drawing secret lines across maps, carving lands for themselves. Trust became a dangerous currency, and hope a fragile flame. For the young men ready to fight, victory seemed close, but it was already tainted by betrayal. Every handshake and signature carried consequences unseen by those who believed in honor. The desert became a proving ground where legends were born not in grand halls, but among shifting dunes. Guerrilla fighters struck at Ottoman garrisons, moving with the wind and shadows as allies and enemies shifted unseen. Every skirmish was a gamble, every victory ephemeral. The young men who lived in a free Arabia were tested not only by bullets, but by the invisible chains of diplomacy, as foreign empires played a game whose rules only they understood. Even amidst victory, shadows of doubt loomed. Leaders whispered of secret agreements, fearing that every triumph might be undercut by foreign hands. The desert, once a sanctuary for rebellion, became a landscape of uncertainty. Those who had fought together for freedom now wondered if the promises they cherished were ever real. As sandstorms raged, so too did the storm of betrayal, invisible yet relentless, shaping destinies far beyond the battlefield. Across continents far from the sands of Arabia, European powers celebrated their secret victories on paper. Borders were drawn, alliances secured, and empires' ambitions codified in ink. The men who had shed blood in the desert would soon discover that freedom had been a mirage. The seeds of modern conflict were planted here, quietly, invisibly, yet their roots would reach through decades, touching every war and every map that followed. The war that no one remembers was shaping the world as we know it today. The promise of freedom was intoxicating. Arab leaders, weary from decades under Ottoman rule, envisioned a new dawn. A kingdom carved from the desert, sovereign and self-determined. Letters and whispers traveled from tents to capitals, each word stirring hope. But in distant halls, European diplomats laughed softly over ink-stained maps. Every promise made to the desert sons was countered by secret agreements that ignored their sacrifices. The war was no longer only on the sand. It had moved into the minds and hearts of those who dared to dream. Across the Mediterranean, secret negotiations shaped destinies. France and Britain drew lines with rulers they would never meet, ignoring tribes, deserts, and the blood spilled in rebellion. What seemed like victory for one was betrayal for another. In tents scattered across Arabia, the men who had fought for honor and independence sensed the invisible hand guiding their fate, a hand cloaked in diplomacy and greed. Letters sent across deserts brought news and hope, but also confusion. Words of encouragement, promises of arms and support, crossed paths with rumors of betrayal. Among the Arab fighters, whispers spread that Europe's loyalty was as shifting as the sands themselves. Trust became fragile, and every decision carried the weight of unseen treaties. This war, shadows, diplomatic and desert-bound, was as deadly as any battle fought with rifles and swords. Meanwhile, T.E. Lawrence moved between two worlds, the desert and the empire. In one, he whispered courage and strategy to men fighting for independence. In the other, he witnessed the subtle manipulations of diplomats shaping maps in distant cities. Every night, under the stars, he questioned the morality of promises made by men who would never see the dunes they divided. In his heart, he understood the peril. Freedom could be won with swords, but lost with ink. By the year's end, the lines of loyalty and betrayal were indistinguishable. Arab princes and rebels believed in the dream of self-rule, while British and French officials signed agreements that ignored the very people they promised to support. The desert had become a chessboard, and every soldier, every leader, a piece in a game whose rules were unknown, the seeds of a modern world. Its borders, conflicts, and alliances were being planted in silence, far from the eyes of those who would inherit its consequences. The desert erupted in motion. Rebel cavalry struck like shadows, moving with uncanny precision across dunes and mountain passes. Small groups of men, armed with rifles and resolve, attacked Ottoman supply lines, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. The war was no longer about treaties. It was about survival, courage, and the knowledge that every victory might vanish if diplomacy betrayed them. The desert was both ally and enemy, concealing and revealing the fates of those who dared to fight upon it. Among the rebels, a strategist moved like a ghost through sand and shadow. He taught men to strike swiftly and vanished, to read the desert as one reads a map. Each raid, each ambush, was a lesson in patience and cunning. But even as victories mounted, the invisible hand of Europe loomed, threatening to transform hard-won freedom into another line on a map drawn far from these sands. The Ottoman forces were relentless, disciplined, and desperate. Generals dispatched cavalry across unforgiving terrain, seeking to crush the rebellion. Yet, the desert itself became a shield for the insurgents, whose knowledge of hidden passes and secret wells gave them an advantage impossible to match. Battles became a dance of shadows, each side anticipating the other, survival dependent on cunning as much as courage. In quieter moments, reflection and camaraderie emerged. Around desert fires, men shared stories of home, of lost families, and of the world they hoped to reclaim. The harsh landscape revealed the humanity beneath the uniform and robe, even as every sunrise promised more battle. In these moments, the rebels understood the cost of freedom, each victory paid for in sweat, blood, and the weight of betrayal that waited silently beyond the horizon. The desert became a crucible, forging leaders and testing loyalties. Skirmishes with Ottoman forces grew bolder, raids became more strategic, and every day the stakes rose. The desert was alive with the footsteps of men determined to carve a new future, yet every small victory carried the unspoken warning. The promises of foreign powers were as shifting as the sand beneath their feet. In this war, survival was a fleeting triumph, and betrayal waited like a storm beyond the dunes. Victory in the desert brought no celebration. The Ottoman Empire had been pushed back, key cities had fallen, and rebels believed independence was within reach. Yet whispers reached the camps. Lines drawn in secret maps, treaties signed without their knowledge, promises of sovereignty sacrificed to imperial ambition. Triumph tasted bitter as the desert wines carried the truth. Freedom had been promised, but betrayal had already taken root. Letters intercepted and rumors confirmed the harsh reality. Britain and France had already carved the spoils of the Arab lands between themselves. The dream of independence was being erased on paper, even as men fought in the sand. Leaders who had trusted foreign promises now faced the ultimate test: how to fight for freedom when the very allies who pledged support were complicit in betrayal. Europe's leaders celebrated in distant halls, while the desert smoldered with uncertainty. Maps signed in secrecy meant that victories in the sand could not translate into sovereignty. Every captured city, every skirmish, every life lost was now part of a game whose rules favored distant powers. The men who had fought for freedom began to understand that some battles were lost long before rifles were raised, and that their desert victories had been tools of foreign ambition. In the desert, disillusionment grew. Soldiers questioned the very nature of the struggle. Promises made with honor were meaningless when treaties signed in distant rooms ignored their sacrifices. Even leaders of the revolt grappled with the heartbreak of realizing that freedom could be an illusion, manipulated by men who saw only power and territory. The desert, once a place of hope, became a reminder of deception. The world beyond the desert was already reshaping their fate. Treaties and secret agreements ignored the lives of those who had fought, replacing them with lines and signatures. Every battle had been fought, every city liberated, yet the dream of sovereignty was slipping through their fingers. The betrayal was complete, and empire promised freedom, and instead delivered maps of control. History would remember some, forget most, and the desert would keep the memory of their courage hidden beneath its sands. The ink on treaties was dry, yet its consequences were monumental. Lines drawn across maps in European offices reshaped continents without a single consultation with those who lived there. New states emerged from the desert, their borders dictated by distant powers rather than tribal allegiance or cultural history. Every signature carried the weight of sovereignty stolen, and every line foretold decades of conflict, rebellion, and unrest. The world was being remade, and the desert had become both witness and victim. In the deserts and cities of Arabia, the reality of the New World Order settled slowly. Arab leaders saw their hopes reduced to lines on a map, treaties drafted without their input. Tribes once united by common cause were divided, old rivalries exploited, and new tensions sown. The promises of freedom had become a distant memory, replaced by the cold certainty of European authority. The desert had given life to revolution, but Europe had claimed its legacy. The treaties were celebrated in Paris and London, yet in the desert, their consequences were already apparent. Armies disbanded, alliances fractured, and local leaders struggled to assert authority over lands that no longer belonged to them. Borders drawn in secrecy replaced centuries of tradition, creating new nations overnight. Every victory of the desert warriors had been co-opted, and every dream of independence had been compromised by the very powers they had trusted. Lines on a map became more than geography. They became symbols of power and control. Ancient rivalries were reignited, communities divided, and the seeds of future revolts planted in ink. The desert, once a theater of daring freedom, was now a landscape of imposed order. The world had been redrawn, but not for those who had fought and suffered in its sands. Their courage was remembered only by the desert winds and the unmarked graves of history. The new map promised stability to the victors, but uncertainty to those who lived under its lines. Tribes and nations found themselves trapped by decisions made oceans away. Every border was a compromise, every line a potential flashpoint. The legacy of this act of cartography would echo through decades, inspiring wars, revolutions, and enduring mistrust. The desert, silent and eternal, had witnessed the birth of a modern Middle East, a region forever shaped by promises, betrayal, and ink on a page. As the guns fell silent, the world celebrated peace. But the celebration came with erasure. Governments rewrote history, glorifying European heroism while erasing the desert campaigns. The men who had fought and died in distant sands became footnotes, their sacrifices omitted from textbooks and official records. Maps were altered, letters vanished, and the truth of the war slowly disappeared beneath layers of bureaucracy and propaganda. The desert remembered, but the world chose to forget. History books celebrated Europe's victories, painting the war as a European affair while ignoring the deserts that had been battlegrounds of rebellion and courage. Entire campaigns vanished from records. Soldiers who had given their lives were erased from memory, and their stories were whispered only by the desert winds. The world would remember Europe, but the deserts, the true crucible of change, would remain a ghosted landscape. Even those who had fought on the front lines faced fading recognition. Norgur, stunning, key. Tribes who had revolted against empires saw their victories appropriated by others. Leaders who had forged alliances with courage discovered their names buried beneath treaties and agreements. The Vanishing War was both a political act and a cultural amnesia, leaving generations to inherit conflicts without knowing their origins. Propaganda and rewritten histories glorified victories in Europe, while quietly removing deserts that had shaped modern nations, cities that had changed hands, villages that had been destroyed, and lives that had been sacrificed disappeared from collective memory. In distant capitals, Europe's story was told, while the Middle East's true struggle became invisible. Its heroes unnamed, its battles undocumented, its consequences only beginning to ripple through the century that followed. The desert held the memory, silent and eternal, of a war that reshaped borders, faiths, and futures. Its stories survived only in whispers among survivors, letters hidden in tents, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to forget. The vanished war had changed the world forever, yet history would remember only fragments, leaving its full truth buried beneath sand, ink, and the politics of forgetting. Decades passed, yet the shadows of the forgotten war stretched across nations. Borders drawn in secrecy became flashpoints for conflict. Alliances forged and broken under foreign influence shaped entire generations, and the dream of sovereignty remained deferred. The men who had fought in deserts long ago had passed into memory, but the consequences of their struggle persisted in politics, in cities, and in the endless deserts that had witnessed their courage. The lessons of betrayal and ambition echoed through history. Wars erupted over borders drawn with pens, empires rose and fell, and generations carried the consequences of decisions made in distant offices. The silent deserts had witnessed courage and sacrifice, yet the story was never fully told. Every modern conflict carried whispers of that vanished struggle, and every ruler and soldier inherited a war they had never fought, but could never ignore. The desert, silent yet unyielding, became both witness and teacher. Its lessons were written not in textbooks, but in rebellion, in mistrust, and in the ever-present struggle for self-determination. Those who walked its sands learned that freedom is fragile, that promises can be hollow, and that the consequences of one forgotten war can echo across centuries, shaping nations, conflicts, and identities in ways history may never fully capture. Even as new empires rose and old ones fell, the ghosts of the forgotten war remained. Cities, nations, and borders were haunted by lines drawn in secrecy, by promises broken, and by sacrifices erased from memory. History may have erased the names and battles, but the world had been irrevocably altered. Every conflict, every revolution, and every quest for justice traced a line back to the desert sands and the men who had fought there, unseen yet transformative. The war may have vanished from textbooks, yet it continues to shape the world. Deserts, cities, and borders remain haunted by its memory. Its lessons endure. Courage without recognition, freedom compromised by ambition, and history written not by those who lived it, but by those who survived to tell only fragments. The forgotten war lives on in the sand, in maps, and in the lives it forever transformed.